Today I want to share a few tips that help to keep my art making as eco-friendly as possible. With all the painting that I do, I always try to make sure that I leave a low carbon footprint and treat materials and resources with care as much as I can. I believe everyone can do their share to act eco-friendly, and even if it's not purely out of concern for our planet, then it can save money, space, and energy. So let's take a look at the few things that I do. My first tip would be to not hoard too many art supplies, but use up what you have and only get what you need. I know it might be seductive to get new paints all the time or to try out new supplies, but this won't necessarily make your technique any better. I've actually written a blog post about this topic, which I will link below, and I have gotten many responses about this. And what I do is I usually stick to the materials that I know will work for me, and I still get a few new tools and pens and paints every year to experiment with, to satisfy my curiosity. Another factor is, of course, that it's always best to get art supplies that were made near you. And these are usually also more inexpensive. So for example, for me it makes a lot of sense to buy watercolor paints by Schminke. It's a German manufacturer, so the transportation is not that crazy, and they are also more inexpensive than other paints for me, and they are readily available everywhere. Let's talk a moment about the paints themselves. So watercolor paints mostly aren't toxic, but there are some pigments that can contain heavy metals. And the amount is so small that this won't harm anyone if your wastewater is treated, and so when you wash out your brushes in the sink, then this won't harm anyone as long as this water is being treated. But you still might want to consider avoiding these paints to minimize the chance of bringing these substances into the environment. So paints that contain heavy metals are any paints with cadmium, cobalt, chromium, nickel, or copper, or also manganese pigments. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to see this because for some of these pigments you can clearly see from the name. So we have cobalt blue, which has cobalt in it. Then there's cobalt turquoise, which also has cobalt, and it also says here on the tube. And then there are some paints, for example this transparent yellow, which seems really harmless, but then you turn it around and it says on the tube that there is actually nickel in it. And for some of these paints you can't deduct it from either the name, and some manufacturers don't even put it on the tubes or on the pens, and you have to go through these color charts or on the menu or look on the manufacturer's website. But it's still a very good practice to do this. And so this, for example, this is cerulean blue. This actually has cobalt in it, so it's a cobalt pigment in essence. Not all of these names will tell you if it's actually a heavy metal pigment. So there are some paint names go like manganese blue hue, and this can mean that the manganese pigment has been taken out or isn't available anymore, and they have replaced the pigments. What you can do is look up the pigment name that's always written down on the tube and see if there's heavy metal in it. That said, you don't have to completely avoid all of these pigments, because in watercolors or any other commercial paint really, heavy metals are not included in such high concentrations that will harm you. It's probably a lot more unhealthy to walk along a big street next to a running car. As long as you don't eat your paints, you should be fine, and of course you shouldn't let your pets near the paint water. But if you want to avoid these pigments, or if you are sensitive to any of the substances that I mentioned, then it's good to know how you can get the necessary information. So manufacturers also usually do not state how and where they source and produce their pigments, and these are often in third world countries. So we don't know the exact environmental consequences of pigment production. I know that in past years some manufacturers have brought out environmentally friendly paints. I haven't researched this topic enough to say if it's for real or if it's just another attempt at clever marketing. So what you should take away from this is that essentially pigments are chemicals and we should keep that in mind when using them. For that reason, when you're field sketching, when you're out in nature painting, then please don't dump your paint water where you sit. Don't dump it into nature, because what you're doing is you're producing little toxic waste dumps that way. I know that a little bit of muddy water doesn't look very dangerous, but some habitats are incredibly sensitive and they can be disturbed very easily, especially by traces of heavy metals. So always try to leave nature as you find it. What you can do is bring a water container with you that has a lid so that you can take your water home with you, your dirty water. Or you could use a water brush that has this tank in the back, and when you're painting and want to change your color, then you simply brush it on a piece of cloth, on an old rag, and then you can continue painting. My next tip would be to care for your supplies to make them last longer. This will not only save you money, but also the mental energy and the time that you would have to spend when you have to go out and buy new supplies all the time. So try and get tools that will last you a long while in the first place. And then hang on to your palette and brush and to your pens and paints as long as you can, and take care of them. Clean them regularly to keep them in good shape. So, for example, I like to use these metal palettes. They are really practical and quite sturdy. They also come in a few different sizes. The only thing that happens is after a while they tend to stain. And what you can do about this is simply use a vinyl eraser and try and erase the stains. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I think it depends on this enamel coat that's on there. Some people have said this also works with plastic palettes. And I've heard that brush soap also works. So there's a specific kind of brush soap sold in art supply stores. What I have found that for cleaning brushes, you don't even need a special brush soap. You could use a mild vegetable or curd soap. This will also work. So just make sure you don't use something too abrasive to clean your brushes. A word about storing brushes. So you should never store your wet brushes with the tip pointing up, because then the water will run down this metal part and start to loosen the hairs, and the hairs will come out, they will fall out. So what I do after I've cleaned my brushes is I just lay them down like this and wait until they're dry, and then I can store them upright. Another thing too is that I also try to keep my palettes and the paints in order and clean them from time to time, especially when I come from a field trip. Let's imagine maybe a day at the beach with a lot of sand and dust, and it's a good idea to clean your paint wells and your palette after a day like this. My next tip would be to use refillable tools. So a good fountain pen like this can last for decades. Sometimes replace small things like the tip. And if you use a converter instead of cartridges, then you avoid plastic waste. So this is a ink cartridge that you can refill directly from an ink bottle. I've also seen metal palettes that were 30 years or older and still in halfway decent shape. You can refill these little pans, these plastic pans, with tube paint once they are empty. And you can even wash out and use these little pans in other palettes if you want. There are some tools that you might want or need that are a little bit harder to refill. So these are some of the throwaway plastic markers that I have, or this, like this here, this gel pen. Other things like there are these kind of glue tape dispensers that aren't refillable. If you research this, there's almost always a version that's refillable, sometimes even from the same manufacturer. So there are alternatives. In the past, I've also successfully refilled some of these throwaway markers. So sometimes you can use pliers and open these, sometimes in the back, sometimes here at the tip, and then use your own ink to refill the part that holds the ink. And of course, it's still always best to get refillable supplies from the start. Another thing that I see frequently is that people are using paper towels to dab their brushes on or to remove paint from the paper. And what you can do instead is use a soft, non-dusty cloth like this. I usually use rags made from old bed sheets or from old t-shirts. So just make sure that the fabric can take water. And for this, cotton usually is the best choice. And you can wash these rags when they get dirty, and then you can reuse them for years before throwing them out. Also, I've never had a problem with dust or lint in my brush or in my paints, so this is really a good trick to reuse old fabric that you would have thrown out otherwise. And lastly, and this is more of a minimalist tip really, is try not to jump around from one technique to the next too soon, or to get a ton of new supplies if you just want to try out something really specific. So often we can use what we already have when we just want to try out if a certain technique works for us. And if you have unused supplies that simply sit in your drawer and take up space and you won't use them again, then don't keep them forever. And don't throw them away either. Just give them to someone else or sell them. I always think about how happy someone else might be about this exact tool that I don't need anymore and that only sits around in my home collecting dust. And I think that's a much better use for these things. These are my ideas for using your art supplies in an environment-friendly way. I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, go ahead and give it a like. Also, let me know if you have other tips for sketching and painting in an eco-friendly way. I'd really love to know your ideas about this. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you want to be notified of new videos. And thank you, and see you soon.